and welcome back to my channel, Pathways to God and Significance. My name is Michael Venema. What I try and do with this channel is present a message that I've given at my church recently on a Sunday morning. So welcome and thanks for plugging in. I'm basing this message on a passage from the Bible. As you might know in these videos, I follow a format where we look at a passage of the Bible and I try to do my best with it, and hopefully it will be a big help to you as well. So Mark chapter 10, verses 32 to 45, and I'm going to be reading the passage in chunks as we move through this video. So the theme here for the video is Jesus walks towards his death, towards the cross, towards his crucifixion. Well, as you might know, kings and queens and other rulers often like to have images or statues made of themselves. You may have noticed that the pictures or statues usually aim to make the ruler look impressive, powerful. For example, you might come across online some of the statues of leaders, particularly in Europe. Often they're sitting on horses. So, for example, Peter the Great from Russia, there's a statue of him. He lived from 1682 to 1725. Anyway, in one particular statue, he's on horseback, a symbol of power. He's in control. You don't want to mess with him. He's worthy of your respect. A little bit further into the African South, you can find images of the pharaohs of ancient Egypt. And in those statues, the pharaohs look calm, in control, and they look larger than life. In fact, in the stone carvings that tell the story of Egypt, those pharaohs are seen as leading their conquered people into captivity and sometimes torturing or killing the people that they have conquered. The pharaohs don't suffer. On the quite opposite, they inflict suffering, and again, someone supposedly worthy of your respect. And when we think of British royalty, we think of figures sitting on a throne with a crown on their heads, figures calling for respect and admiration. Now, the Jewish people of Jesus' time thought much the same way. When they pictured the kind of leader they wanted, they pictured someone like King David. Now, King David, about 1,000 years before Jesus, King David had led the Israelites into a kind of golden age. The borders of the country were secured, farming and trading prospered, the royal treasury was in the black. David was committed to God and his people, and although he sinned greatly, he came back to the ways of God. And you might know that Jesus' own ancestry goes back to King David, one way of tracing Jesus' ancestry, and that's one of the reasons that the people called him, among other things, Son of David. So that's kind of a glorious title. Now, Jesus, it turns out, had a number of glorious titles. The Son of David, one of them, and we can see in Mark that the title that Jesus most often used for himself was the Son of Man. Now, this title comes from the book of Daniel, where one, like a son of man, has great authority over all things, all nations, all people. And then another title, in Mark chapter 8, one of the disciples, Peter, announces that Jesus is the Messiah, the chosen leader for the people, someone that God has chosen. And in Mark 9, three of the disciples, Peter, James, and John, they see Jesus transformed into a glorious figure full of the power and the light of God. So a lot of glorious titles, glorious pictures of Jesus that we see accounted or documented in Mark. Now, that's why when Jesus says he will suffer in Mark chapter 8, 9, and 10, when Jesus says that he will suffer, the disciples have a very hard time with this. It would be like saying that King Charles will have to become homeless in his own country. Great figures, important leaders are above suffering. Let's see just how the disciples respond when Jesus in those 3 chapters talks about his suffering and death. In Mark 8, when Jesus began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the teachers of the law, and that he must be killed and after 3 days rise again, he spoke plainly about this, And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him. In other words, the disciples thought they could scold Jesus for thinking along these lines. Now, there are some reasons for that, which I just have to leave it there for now. Maybe we'll get into that some other time. The second time Jesus predicts his death in Mark is in chapter 9, and the response is this: the disciples, we read, did not understand what he meant, and they were afraid to ask him about it. Then in Mark 10, which is our focus for this video, Jesus again says that he'll be condemned and tortured and killed, and that he'll rise again. Here's how it goes. The disciples were confused as Jesus led them toward Jerusalem. More about that in just a second. But and the other disciples, the other followers, were afraid. And once again, Jesus took the 12 disciples aside and told them what was going to happen to them. He said, "We are now on our way to Jerusalem, where the Son of Man will be handed over to the chief priests and teachers of the law of Moses. They will sentence him to death and hand him over to foreigners," Gentiles, pagans, the Roman occupiers, "who will make fun of him, mock him, spit on him, and they will beat him and kill him. But 3 days later, he will rise from the dead." James and John, they have an interesting response. They realize that something big is afoot, and they ask to become Jesus' right and left hand men. Jesus reminds them that they must be willing to suffer, just as he gave his life as a ransom for many. Now, the thing is, Jesus has been to Jerusalem before. He's made enemies there. And I don't mean that he's physically attacked anyone, but his teachings offended the established Jewish teachers of the faith, and quite early in Mark, we discover that those leaders are out to kill Jesus. In Mark 3, the Pharisees went out to plot with the Herodians. The Pharisees and the Herodians are two powerful factions of the Jewish community. They plot how they might kill Jesus. And when you read Mark, you discover just how intensely those opponents of Jesus despised him. If it wasn't for his popularity, they would have attacked him sooner than they did. And this is why the disciples are astonished and shocked that Jesus is going back to Jerusalem. He's walking straight into trouble. If there's one place where they could all get into serious difficulty, that was the place. And so the disciples and the other followers too are shocked and astonished that he's going there. And that's part of their response to Jesus going to Jerusalem. Well, is there another way that we can understand this difficulty? That on the one hand, Jesus is glorious titles, and on the other hand, he's walking into suffering. I think it's very helpful to understand that Jesus brings together two streams of Jewish understanding about what the leader of God's people would be like. The chosen leader, the Messiah, would come in glory and be exalted, but also a chosen leader would suffer for the people. And Jesus brings these two streams together. As I often say, Jesus was thoroughly Jewish in his self-understanding. Jesus, the Messiah, God's chosen one, the glorious Son of Man, but he also takes upon himself the role of the suffering servant that we find in the book of Isaiah, written about 700 years, some other parts of it not quite that late, but 700 years or so before Jesus. And we see this picture of the suffering servant most clearly in Isaiah chapters 52 and 53. And here are some of the lines of those chapters. "See, my servant will act wisely. He will be raised and lifted up and highly exalted." So, on the one hand, highly exalted, but think of it being raised, and think of Jesus being raised on a cross. Just as there were many who were appalled at him, his appearance was so disfigured beyond that of any human being, and his form marred beyond human likeness. As you might know, when people are crucified, which still happens today at times, when people are or were crucified, they are severely disfigured. Surely he took up our pain, bore our suffering, and yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. He was pierced. Think of Jesus, pierced in the hands and in his side. He was pierced for our transgressions, crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Maybe sometime I'll do a video on those two chapters, Isaiah 52 and 53. But here's the thing. I think that the Jewish people who saw Jesus suffer and who saw him crucified would have been almost blind not to see Jesus in those two chapters of Isaiah. In his life and his death, Jesus brought together, on one hand, the hope of a glorious leader, and on the other hand, the tradition of the suffering servant. Anyway, James and John, let's look at their response. I've already said a little bit about their response, but it seems that they don't have a clue about any of this, or if they do, they're in denial. They do sense, that something big is happening. They sense an opportunity. James and John, the sons of Zebedee, here's how the reading goes. They come to Jesus and they say, "Teacher, we want you to do for us whatever you ask." Now, when my kids were little, that was the kind of thing they would say to me. Anyway, Jesus says, "Well, what do you want me to do?" And they replied, "Let one of us sit at your right hand and the other on your left in your glory." In other words, how about making one of us, we might say in modern times, how about making one of us the Minister of Finance and the other the Secretary of Defense? So Jesus has a response for them. "You don't know," he says, "what you're asking. Can you drink the cup I'm going to be drinking, or be baptized with the baptism I'm going to be baptized with?" The cup Jesus is referring to is almost for sure his drawing on the old Jewish symbol found in the Old Testament, a symbol for the cup of God's judgment. Jesus will accept God's judgment for our sins on himself. And the baptism Jesus mentions is that he will go under, going under the water of baptism, going down into the water, so to speak, of death. So, James and John, what do you say to that? Well, yep, they say, we can drink the cup and go into the baptism with you, Jesus. It seems to me that they're replying to Jesus with kind of a naive optimism. Hey, Jesus, of course, whatever needs to be done, we'll be there. We don't exactly know what you're talking about, but, whatever needs to be done, we'll be there with you. Well, Jesus says to them, you will drink the cup I'm going to drink, and you will be baptized into the baptism I'm going to be baptized into. But for me to give to you those places, that's for someone else. That's for God to give. Those places belong to those for whom they have prepared. It sounds a little cryptic, but Jesus is really saying, that's not my decision, that's God's. And as you might know, most, if not all, the disciples suffered greatly as they led the early church after Jesus' activities. Many were killed in the line of duty. Jesus' words that they would drink the cup that Jesus drank and be baptized into the suffering and death that Jesus went through, those words came true. Well, let's finish up with our reading from Mark 10 and get to what this might mean for you and me. When the 10 heard about this, the other 10 disciples, they became indignant with James and John. And Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as the Gentiles, the Roman rulers, they lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wants to be first must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man, himself, even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. In other words, if James and John, or the other 10 disciples, or if you and I think that following Jesus is a quick path to comfort, and if you're a leader in the church community, leadership without opposition, we must think again. If we want to truly follow Jesus, here's one of the key things we need to do: to accept that you and I will take on burdens, will take on responsibilities, will take on suffering, just as Jesus did. God calls us to keep speaking the good news. He calls us to keep living according to his ways. And this means accepting difficulties and serving each other, just as Jesus himself served others. Not lording it over everyone, but walking humbly with God and with our neighbors. Just as Jesus spent himself to bring blessing and eternal life to many, we also are called by God to spend our lives serving his purposes, reaching out with the love of the suffering and risen Jesus Christ. Being a follower of Jesus is wonderful, but it's not always easy. For most believers, it's a lifetime of slow, steady, faithful effort. Sometimes there are painful sacrifices, but always there is Jesus. He is there. He is here.